Hey everyone, welcome back. We're continuing our reading of Martin Heidegger's Metaphysics. It's been fantastic. We are still dealing with paragraph 145. He is kind of wordy, as I've mentioned before, but I do think that you will gain some skills after nerding out on him. And you'll be able to identify sophistry much better and follow along different strings of reasoning that at first might appear to be sort of red herrings, but if you follow certain ones and then are able to connect them back, you will have a sense of distinction more, I believe. That's what I've gotten from it, and I've studied under people who really liked Heidegger, and they were very good teachers. So, let's continue. Now, the collapse of unconcealment, as we briefly call this happening, the happening of the collapse of unconcealment, follow? Does not originate from a mere deficiency. Notice this. The unconcealment process, even though it's a collapsation, does not stem from deficiency, follow? From an inability to sustain any longer that which, with its essence, was given to historical humanity to preserve. Historical humanity having a duty to preserve the essence that was originally the phusis and being and aletheia and kategoria and logos and noisa. Alright. The ground of the collapses lies first in the greatness of the inception. That's something interesting because what goes up must come down, is what I say, and what others have said. But this is interesting, the greatness coming from the collapse, the pressure thereof, maybe. Let's see how he words this. The greatness of the inception and in the essence of the inception itself. So let's put a little bubble next to those two things here. So the ground of collapse is based upon two fundamental factors, he tells us. The essence of the inception and the greatness of it. Greatness and the essence. You follow? Fall and collapse create an illusion of negativity, only in a superficial exposition. That is true. We think of... because the way we use it in natural language, and if you're familiar with Heidegger, he's not too much of a fan of natural language. He considers it almost a process that conceals rather than reveals, right? Due to humans' tad bit laziness to dig under the surface, right? The inception as incipient must in a certain way leave itself behind. Whoa, that's cool. The inception being able to leave itself behind. It's almost like it has a little mind of its own. It started from this jump point and then went on to something else. It thus necessarily conceals itself. But this self-concealing is not nothing. Well, clearly not, right? The inception that initiates can never directly preserve its initiating. Oh, look at that. There we go. That's a Heideggerian quote right there. Because, in the class, so people will say jokes like, the thingliness of the thingness, the workiness of the work. And at first that sounds like Dr. Seuss. When you start to think about it, you start to see there's a little bit of nugget there of truth. So the inception that initiates can never directly preserve its initiating. So an inception that has the first instance of its own self-inception, it cannot preserve its own initiation. Look at that. It can never preserve it only the one way that it can be preserved, namely, by retrieving it more originally and its originality. There we go. Look at that. So we have inception that initiates not being able to directly preserve its initiating. And then, secondly, originality in its originality. That's a Heideggerian quote that could go on a t-shirt. Oh, that'd be awesome. Therefore, we can address the inception and the collapse of truth solely in a thoughtful retrieval. So the way in which we'll address the inception is by examining through a thoughtful retrieval process at the almost collapse bubble of the truth itself. Yeah, that's interesting. The urgency of being and the greatness of its inception are not merely an object for historians to observe, explain, and evaluate. Now, I wonder... Well, I guess you'd have to talk to his... Because remember, he has the historical Dasein. And not all historians are focusing on language and how things got recorded. What's that dude's name? Oh, I had to read his book. He's very Zimmerman. Hans Zimmerman's the composer, but there's another Zimmerman who wrote a history book that's now really popular in many classes because it kind of shows what's been left out. Because many historians are not able to really go to the deeper levels to explain events and what led up to it. Especially because history is written by the victor, right? So he has a point here, Heidegger. This does not preclude, but instead demands the possibility that this collapse be displayed as far as possible in its historical course. Okay, yeah, that's what we hope for. We hope for that we have even the possibility to examine a collapse of a historical event so that we can see the urgency of being and its greatness, right? We want that, but with censorship, we're not going to be able to do that. Heidegger would not have been a fan of cancel culture and anti-free speech wackos, right? Clearly. Here on the path of this lecture course, one decisive hint must suffice. Ooh, one decisive hint must suffice. So remember, he got into the one again. He's been going on his little one. Remember, he said here, once neither beings nor gatherings could be preserved and understood on the basis of unconcealment, only one possibility remained. And here he says again here, one decisive hint must suffice. So he has put one in italics twice within the same paragraph. So the original inception, its inceptive originality, is its idea and its assertion, oisa, and kategoria. Well, they're going to be in the remnants of the collapse, he contended. So let's see what he says. What is this hint? What is it? We know from Heraclitus and Parmenides, so Heraclitus and Parmenides, they are pre-Socratics. Parmenides is pretty with his atoms and Heraclitus with his fire. Thales with his water. They're pretty interesting. I wish more of their works would have survived, but it's pretty ancient. Pretty ancient. The unconcealment of beings is not simply present at hand. Clearly not. Yeah, clearly not. Unconcealment happens only insofar as it is brought about by the work. Aha, yeah, you gotta put some effort into it to unconceal it. It's not just gonna be there for you to see, he's saying, right? And I think we all can agree with that. My pen is exploding on my hand. The work of the word as poetry, the work of stone in a temple and statue, the work of the word as thinking, the work of the polis as the site of history, that grounds and preserves all this. Aha, here we go. See, he's getting into it. The work of the word, when he says, that's funny that I made the joke about the workiness of the work, and then later on in this paragraph 146, he goes into the work tone here. Notice this though, you gotta pay attention to this. Work of the word as poetry. The words are working in poetry to give you a word. The word. A truth embedded within the poetry itself that you extract. You follow? Now notice this. The polis, the work of the polis, right? The center, the city. What happens there? It's the inception of the ideas that get bled out and unfold onto the people. And they have to trace it back to see where the original inception went at the polis. You see? I think a common language term is follow the money and you'll see who's doing it. You'll see who the puppet masters are. That's kind of a less sophisticated way of trying to get you to understand what Heidegger means when he's saying this. But there's a lot of different ways you can interpret Heidegger. However, that isn't one way. Work, according to what we said earlier, is here always to be understood in the Greek sense of ergon. Okay, we have to put a little note to that. Work, and then slash ergon. E-R-G-O-N, another Greek term for us. So if you're keeping track, we have ergon, we have aletheia, we have logos, we have kategoria, we have phusis, right? Oisa. We got a lot of terms here. You got to keep them down. As that which comes to presence and which is produced into unconcealment. Ah, look at that. So ergon, it comes to presence, he's contending, and it produces into an unconcealment. So the process thereof, not something too far off from what he was getting at earlier. The striving for the unconcealment of beings, and thus of being in the work, this striving for the unconcealment of beings, which in itself already, hold on, pause here though. The striving for unconcealment of beings. So seeing what's there, what's the original essence, right? The unconcealment whole process, and thus of being in the work, capital being though. So notice this: beings, and thus of being in the work. Being in the work. This striving for the unconcealment of beings, which in itself already happens, only as a constant antagonism. Yes, he reiterated that for us. So this sort of thrashing, swaying, it's going to have some type of violent force, he said. It's going to unconceal it. This is not something soft that just goes boop, or like it's at hand, it's just lying there right there. No, this is something that has to actually have some energy, right? Is always the same time the strife against concealment. Okay, notice this. The antagonism between concealment and unconcealment. Covering up and against seeming. So, against seeming. Against covering up. Very fascinating. Very telling. One decisive hint. So, it appears that the hint we're getting at here is this relationship of the friction between concealment and unconcealment, and the friction stemming from the striving, right? But the striving is linked to the inception and the collapse. Okay, very telling. What do you think?